So I wanted to take a second to kind of talk about something that's bothering me about the philosophical lectures I listen to. And a lot of it has to stem with this idea of epistemology and philosophy in the same conversation. I understand that in epistemology we pretty much use the same exact methods to discover what people think, what people know, how they believe, why they believe, the confidence levels, and all that other stuff we learn about epistemology. I understand the methods are pretty much the same as they are in philosophy. But I kind of want to separate philosophy from epistemology. I mean, they're two different questions to me. In my opinion, philosophy is the search for truth. You know, what is true? And that's the question we ask, is like, well, I see this. Well, what is true? Is what we see what we actually see? Why do we see it that way? Things along those lines. And then epistemology is, well, what do you know? And why you know it, and how you know it, and all that other stuff that goes along with it. And while there's an epistemology of why a person is trying to debate a philosophical argument, if you're making an epistemological argument as a philosophical argument, you're asking a different question. In my opinion, when someone says, oh, my goal isn't to prove that this is true, I automatically think you're trying to talk epistemology and not philosophy. Because the confidence of how much you believe something or how likely it seems is very subjective and personal. Whereas whatever is true regardless of how it is to you. This personal idea of truth, I just don't subscribe to it. I think epistemology and philosophy are just two completely different things. This is quite obvious when you start talking to a lot of theological philosophers who say pretty much word for word what I said. What is more likely? Whether it's Mike Gita, who favors Bayesian logic and Bayesian calculations of likelihood and probability, or William Lane Craig, who just states it's more likely just for the hell of it. Unfortunately, I don't think these things work as well as they think they do. But we see that with secularists all the time too, who want to kind of twist, sort of have a kind of language abuse about what philosophy is and what epistemology is and how it kind of intertwines. It shouldn't intertwine. They shouldn't. I mean, there was a time when I would basically say I don't give a flying fuck about epistemology. And I don't when we're trying to discuss philosophy. If we're just trying to discuss what is true, I don't give a shit about what you believe. I don't give a shit about how much you believe it and how confident you are in the answer and, you know, how much subjective experience you have with it. In fact, the entire point of philosophy is to realize that our subjective experiences, our personal experiences, really don't mesh well with the actual reality of what's going on in the world. It's not that I don't like epistemology. It's not like I think epistemology is useless. It's not useless. It's just not philosophy, and I think we have to stop thinking they intertwine. They don't. They don't intertwine. It's either true or it's not. It either is or is not, as Plato and Socrates put it. This in-between state of more likely true is it's irrelevant when we're talking about philosophy. And there's a lot of, you know, philosophers, especially modern philosophers, who like to play with the language to try and encourage some kind of epistemology about what we know is true. I'm going to address one of the myths that go out there, and that's, oh, well, science doesn't make proclamations of truth. Yeah, it does. When it's making observations of what it's true, what they see, what they experience. And we perform experiments and studies to make sure what we see is what we see, and we make proclamations based on those observations. Those are all proclamations of truth. This idea that there's no proclamations of truth, it doesn't make any sense to me. And then we make a hypothesis. We make a proclamation of truth, and then we test that hypothesis. Science makes proclamations of truth all the time. In fact, they make proclamations of truth throughout the entire scientific method. The only difference is that we test those proclamations, and we stop believing, or we stop assuming it's true when something contradicts it. And we never state absoluteness. And I think that's what they want to get to. They're filling in this epistemological aspect of philosophy to try and separate science from philosophy. Science is a method of philosophy. That's what it is. That's what it was designed for. It was developed based on all the other methods of philosophy. To think that, what else is the purpose of the method? And if you think about it, science has gotten us closer to the truth than any other method we've come to agree with. I mean, Socrates got us closer than bald-faced guessing and just, oh, look, this is how it looks, so it must be true. And then Aristotle kind of filled in the gaps from being denying our experiences to trying to fill in the gaps of positive truth, of trying to figure out what it was. And I'm not knocking them, but they don't hold a candle to science. Science is more thorough, science is more efficient, science has actually done more to discover what the truth is. And this play with the language about, oh, well, science never says anything is true. It's like, well, science never claims that the truth is absolute, and I don't think anybody should. In fact, I don't think Socrates said the truth was absolute. Socrates said, and I'm one with Socrates that says, there is an absolute truth, we just don't know what it is, and we're probably incapable, by ourselves at least, to discover what that is. So this weird play with the language doesn't make any sense to me. And every time I listen to philosophy lectures, a lot of times it's to separate philosophy from science and intertwine epistemology with philosophy. I don't agree with that. The goal of science is to figure out what's true. That's philosophy. The goal of Socratic method is to figure out what's true. That's philosophy. The goal of aristocratic method is to figure out what's true. So I don't understand what they're trying to say, how they don't make proclamations of truth, because we've found more truth in science than we have in any other method. Now, that kind of sounds like sciences. I mean, in a way it is. But just because you come with me with a Socratic argument or an aristocratic argument doesn't mean I'm not going to take it seriously and think you're making some kind of proclamation of truth. I understand, and I'm going to evaluate it on its own merit. I am. I agree you can get the truth with Socratic method. You can get the truth with the aristocratic method. You can get the truth with logical syllogisms and things along those lines. But if you're going to tell me like what's more accurate, what's more efficient, it's going to go to science. Hands down, it's going to go to science. This idea that, well, science can't investigate this or science can't investigate that, it's just said as if it's some kind of stature or some kind of law. But the only thing that I can think of why science can't investigate something is because science is dependent on evidence. The observations are dependent on evidence. If you don't have evidence, you don't have science. That's the only restriction. And to me, it's not really that much of a restriction, because if there is no evidence, chances are it doesn't even really matter. So even if there is truth without evidence, like they claim with God, chances are, who cares? It is not going to affect us, at least in any important way. And that's kind of the truth I've been subscribing to. I know it's kind of nihilistic that way, but it's kind of how I feel. I feel that there really is no gold at the end of the rainbow or heaven at the end of our life. It's just there's no reason to investigate anything but what we have. And if we try to investigate further than what we have, we're probably going to come up with falsehoods. It's going to be wrong. The answer is going to be wrong, and we shouldn't be doing this. And if you subscribe as a person, an individual, if you subscribe to that kind of thinking, you're going to fall for bullshit. You're going to fall for like the pseudoscience that's out right now that's based on that. The you know, bad medicine, the bad pseudo medicine that's out there. You're going to fall for, you know, con artists. You're going to fall for evangelical preachers who want 10% of your savings that they themselves don't even give. That's basically just the way it's going to be. And if you don't subscribe to believing what we have as opposed to something else that we can't investigate because there's a lack of evidence. If there's a lack of evidence, there's no evidence. No logical syllogism is going to fill that gap. And I don't have a problem with logical syllogisms, but logical syllogisms is only evidence that it's logical. It's not evidence that it's true. There are plenty of things that I can think are logical that aren't true. You have to have something earthly, you have to have something real to cement it to reality before you can claim it's true. And when you have theological philosophers who have nothing but logical syllogisms and no hard evidence of the real, then you're stuck with believing that crap. And you're stuck with looking at this series of logical syllogisms and saying, well, it's not true. I agree it might be logical, which I'm not going to get into that argument. I don't think most logical syllogisms that theological philosophers put out are logical, at least not anymore. They might have been before we knew what we knew about the beginning of the universe. But they don't have anything to cement it into the real, into reality, into something, some kind of evidence to not only say that, oh, well, this is logical, but that it's also true. If they had that, then we might be able to investigate further and come up with new logical syllogisms of why this evidence is pertinent and what this evidence means. And they just haven't done that. And that's the only separation between some forms of philosophy, some people's philosophy, and science. Science has the evidence. Philosophy works with evidence too. I'm not saying philosophy doesn't. And the reason I still think philosophy is valid is because you're not going to sit and take an entire series of tests and methods and investigations to try to figure out what's true. You're not going your day-to-day life to using science. You're just not. So other methods are easier. Socratic method is easier. You contrive the statement. If the statement is able to be contrived, then you can't claim it's true. And then even aristocratic method is a hell of a lot faster than scientific method. And that's important because it helps you think. Learning the logical fallacies, the aristocratic fallacies, learning the modern philosophy logical fallacies, going through the motions of how they do it, the method itself. It's important because it's a lot faster, and you can do that in your day-to-day life when you're talking to your friends, when you're talking to your coworkers, in your job. To be honest, I wish that jurors at least took an introductory day to discuss aristocratic methods so that they understand what the law is supposed to do. I don't think that a lot of jurors are expected to present this kind of "this is what I believe" kind of thing, as opposed to looking at the evidence, thinking about it logically and reasonably. And that's what lawyers want. Lawyers don't want jurors that want the truth. They want jurors that will side with them, which is why they get to pick and choose jurors. But we could use a lot of these philosophical concepts that are more accurate than what we're currently using, but are a lot quicker to do, and we don't. So I don't have anything against philosophy or epistemology, but I'll get to that in a second. I don't have anything against philosophy or the rest of philosophy over science. I just think that science, because it's so thorough, because it's so exact, and because it's reliant on evidence, real evidence, that science is going to be more accurate, more efficient, and get us to the correct answer much faster, much better, and much more accurately than any other philosophical method can. And I started this introduction about epistemology. Now, epistemology is what you know, and we use philosophical methods to determine that, but they were focusing on the individual, on the person. It's relatively new to me that I kind of experienced this separation between philosophy and epistemology. I enjoy it. There are some epistemological evaluations that I don't enjoy. Unanswerable questions are stupid. There should be no such thing as an unanswerable question. If you're giving a person an unanswerable question and then giving them a philosophical overview of why they believe, why they answered that question the way they answered it, I think that's stupid. I think that is subjective. And if you study psychology and neurology, you can realize that you can also manipulate, just simply by facial features and tics and tone of voice, you can actually manipulate their answer. And this jump between, and I see this a lot in street epistemology, this jump of saying, oh, I'm absolutely certain to, well, I'm not as certain as I thought I was, is because of that is very temporary and is very unreliable. It's still interesting. It's still fun. It still tells us something. It tells us how beliefs are different from person to person, how these things can be done. But other than that, it doesn't provide us truth. It doesn't tell us what is true. It tells us how it might help us to gauge how we can better ourselves individually. And even socially, if people are watching street epistemology or even stage epistemology or even a study of epistemology, like a lecture or a class or something like that, it's very interesting. You'll probably learn about yourself, and you'll learn how to engage with people and try to help people get to a philosophical state as opposed to an emotional or subjective state. But outside of that, it does nothing to tell us what is true. So when I see a philosophical debate and the first thing someone says is how much you believe it, or what is more likely, or what is more probable, I can automatically tell that I'm going to be seeing epistemological arguments. Because none of these people will actually have the mathematics, because probability is a statistical term. And is studied as a statistical anomaly, not a physical anomaly. So I automatically know that I'm looking at epistemological arguments, which none of the classical philosophers were ever into. In fact, ad populum was one of the biggest things. Just because a whole lot of people believe it doesn't mean it's true. Just because a whole lot of people believe it's more likely doesn't mean it's true. And it's been proven. It's been demonstrably proven that that's the case. So this probability using ad populum, using other aristocratic fallacies is exactly what Aristotle was warning us about in his writings. Exactly what Pluto was writing about, and what Socrates was writing about in Pluto's writings, and what Pluto himself wrote about after Socrates was arrested. So we shouldn't be using epistemology in a philosophical sense. Ever. Ever. We need to stop that. If you're talking about what is true, you're talking about what is true. And science is a philosophical jump. It is trying to determine what's true, and it does it in a much more thorough manner, and it's dependent on evidence, which is what's more important, because evidence gives us what is real as opposed to what is logical, what is reasonable. I don't really care, because, one, that's kind of language abuse. There is a sense of reasonable that involves reality. But most of the time people are talking about reasonable, it's, especially the modern philosophers, they're talking about individually a reasonable argument, that he's not thinking reasonably, which, even if he's thinking reasonably, doesn't mean it's true. And I'll get fight back on that. It's like, well, that's the entire definition of reasonable. No, reasonable means he has a reason. And reasonable in terms of a philosophical argument means that if the philosophical argument is reasonable, it means it reached a reasonable, they reached it using the method reasonably. Doesn't mean it's true. And just because they didn't doesn't mean it's not true. That's one of Aristotle's fallacies, the fallacy. Just because it's argued poorly, or that they didn't follow the method correctly, any of the methods correctly, doesn't mean it's not true. It just means that he's a dumbass. So you can call me a scientist if that's your definition. If your definition is that I believe that, yes, science is making proclamations of truth, and those proclamations have been more accurate than any other philosophical method, and that's what you want to say I'm a scientist for, I'll wear that badge proudly. To be honest, I don't believe that's possible. I don't believe a person can use the scientific method in his day-to-day life. I think it's way too in-depth. I think they have to make decisions a whole hell of a lot faster than that. So I don't think I'm going to refuse to listen to any other philosophical argument. It's just science is better at it. It just takes longer.